What if the silence around your life is not empty at all, but full of invisible arrangements your anxious mind is too tired to recognize? There are seasons when nothing seems to move. You pray, you wait, you do your part, you try to stay faithful, and still the door does not open. The message does not come. The answer remains unclear. The person does not change. The opportunity does not arrive. From the outside, it looks as if life has become still, almost indifferent, as if the universe has lowered its voice at the exact moment you needed reassurance the most. And this is where the ego begins to suffer, because the ego does not understand holy silence. It only understands evidence. It wants a date, a sign, a timeline, a visible result it can hold in its hands and say, yes, this means I have not been forgotten. But God does not always arrange your life in the places where your eyes can reach. Sometimes the deepest work is taking place behind the curtain, beneath the soil, under the surface of what you keep calling delay. Perhaps you have been trying to hold together a relationship that feels different now, not because you are weak, but because you are afraid that letting go would mean admitting you were wrong to care so much. Perhaps you have been trying to force progress in a dream that still matters to you, checking every possible path, measuring every small silence as if it were proof that nothing is happening. Perhaps you have been waking up each morning with a quiet pressure in your chest, doing what needs to be done, answering emails, driving familiar roads, keeping your face calm in front of people who have no idea how much uncertainty you are carrying inside. And because nothing obvious has changed, you assume God has not moved. But that may be the misunderstanding. In Jungian language, the ego is the part of you that helps you function in the visible world. It plans, protects, compares, calculates, and tries to keep you safe. But when the ego is frightened, it begins to mistake control for faith. It believes that if you are not constantly checking, pushing, explaining, proving, or preparing for disappointment, everything important will slip away. Yet, the self, the deeper center of your being, does not move with that kind of panic. The self listens for alignment. The self notices when your peace leaves a room before your body does. The self feels when something you once wanted has begun to cost too much of your inner life. And in the language of faith, this may be where God begins to work most quietly, not by giving you instant proof, but by loosening your grip on the version of life your fear has been trying to preserve. This is not the same as being abandoned. This is not evidence that you have prayed wrong, waited too long, or missed your only chance. It may be preparation. It may be protection. It may be the unseen order rearranging people, timing, capacity, and truth before anything appears in front of you. The hard part is that while God is arranging, the ego feels ignored. While the soul is being prepared, the mind feels delayed. While the next chapter is being formed, the old part of you keeps asking why nothing is happening. But the deeper question is not, why has nothing changed yet? The deeper question is, what is being arranged in the dark that you would interrupt if you kept forcing the light to appear too soon? There is a kind of silence that makes the mind restless because it does not arrive with an explanation. It does not tell you whether to keep waiting, whether to walk away, whether to try one more time, or whether the whole thing has already been decided somewhere beyond your reach. It simply stays there, quiet, wide, and difficult to interpret. And because the ego cannot bear an unfinished sentence, it begins to write its own ending. It says silence means rejection. It says delay means denial. It says if nothing has appeared by now, then nothing is being arranged. But this is often where the deeper misunderstanding begins, because God does not always give evidence when the human mind asks for it. Sometimes God gives a pause. Sometimes God gives a closed road, not as punishment, but as protection from a direction that would have taken more from you than it could ever have given back. Sometimes the answer is not a sudden open door, but a strange slowing down, a gentle interruption, a repeated feeling in your body that says something is not aligned, even though your mind keeps trying to explain it away. This was the season Rebecca Miller could not yet name. On the outside, her life in Portland looked steady. She managed schedules, solved problems, answered messages, helped other people feel organized, and moved through each week with the quiet, disciplined people admired in her. But inside, there was a growing uneasiness she kept trying to cover with more effort. She told herself that if she remained patient, if she stayed kind, if she chose the right words, if she controlled her reactions carefully enough, Then the relationship would become clear, the work would feel meaningful again, and the heaviness in her chest would finally lift. Yet every time she tried to force certainty out of uncertainty, she felt smaller afterward, as if some part of her had stepped back from life. That is what silence often reveals. It does not create the truth. It removes the noise that kept you from hearing it. In Jungian language, the ego wants proof because proof gives it the illusion of safety. It wants to see the next 5 miles before taking one more step. It wants the other person to explain themselves, the opportunity to announce itself, the future to become visible before trust is required. But the self, the deeper center of the person, does not always speak through visible certainty. Sometimes it speaks through loss of peace. Sometimes it speaks through exhaustion that no full night of sleep can completely repair. Sometimes it speaks through the quiet sense that you are working very hard to keep alive something that no longer breathes naturally. In the language of faith, this may be grace moving in a form you did not recognize. A pause can be grace. A delay can be grace. A door that refuses to open can be grace. Not because disappointment is easy, and not because every painful moment should be romanticized, but because there are moments when God protects you by not letting your fear rush you into what your soul already knows is too small. The hardest part is that protection does not always feel like comfort at first. Sometimes it feels like confusion. Sometimes it feels like being left alone with questions. Sometimes it feels like standing in a hallway after the lights have gone dim, wondering why the room you wanted no longer opens the way it used to. But a hallway is not the same as abandonment. It can be transition. It can be the narrow place between the life your ego planned and the life your deeper self is becoming ready to enter. And if you keep forcing every door just because silence frightens you, you may interrupt the very mercy that is trying to slow you down long enough to see what is true. The ego wants a plan because a plan makes uncertainty feel smaller. It wants to know when the call will come, when the door will open, when the burden will lift, when the person will finally speak clearly, when the next season will begin. It wants dates, details, confirmation, and visible movement. And because it was created to help you survive in the outer world, the ego is not evil. It is the part of you that remembers what hurt, what failed, what disappeared too suddenly, what made you feel powerless before. So when life becomes quiet, the ego does what it has learned to do. It scans. It calculates. It compares. It tries to read hidden meaning into every delay, every pause, every unanswered message, every opportunity that seems to move just out of reach. But the ego can only interpret life through what it can see, and that is why it becomes frightened so easily. It does not know how to trust what is still forming beneath the surface. It does not know how to wait without turning waiting into self-punishment. It does not know how to stand in a hallway without assuming that every closed door is proof of rejection. The self, in Jungian language, moves differently. The self is not merely the part of you that wants comfort or success. It is the deeper center of the whole personality, the organizing wisdom beneath the noise of fear, performance, and social expectation. The ego asks, how do I get what I want? The self asks, who am I becoming while I wait for it? The ego asks, how can I make this door open? The self asks, does this door still belong to the life that is true for me? The ego asks, how do I keep this person, this role, this image, this plan? The self asks, what part of me disappears every time I betray my peace in order to keep it? This is where many people misunderstand their own exhaustion. They think they are tired because life is demanding too much, but sometimes they are tired because the ego is spending enormous energy maintaining a direction the self has already begun to outgrow. Rebecca had felt this for months before she had language for it. At work, she could still lead meetings, solve scheduling problems, answer calls, and remain composed when everyone else seemed scattered. But in quiet moments, especially during her drive home along the wet evening streets of Portland, she would feel a strange heaviness rise inside her, not dramatic, not loud, just persistent. It was not simply sadness. It was the feeling of living slightly outside herself, as if she were acting out a version of stability that no longer matched the truth moving underneath. Her ego told her to keep going, to be mature, to be patient, to not overthink, to not need too much clarity. But herself was speaking through the body, through the fading peace, through the quiet withdrawal of life from places where she used to force herself to remain. In the language of faith, this is often how God begins to guide before circumstances change. Not always through a clear sign in the sky, not always through a sudden answer, but through the loss of inner agreement with what once seemed acceptable. Something in you stops consenting. Something in you no longer bows before the old fear. Something in you begins to sense that forcing the outcome may cost more of your soul than losing the outcome ever could. And when that realization begins, the question changes. It is no longer only, what is God going to give me? It becomes, what is God trying to free me from before I receive what is next? Rebecca Miller did not have the kind of life that looked broken from the outside. That was part of what made her pain so difficult to explain. She had a steady job, a clean apartment in Southeast Portland, a calendar full of responsibilities, and the kind of calm voice people trusted when things became uncertain. At 42, she had become skilled at holding rooms together. If a meeting became tense, she softened her tone. If a deadline shifted, she reorganized the plan. If someone needed reassurance, she gave it before they even asked. People often told her she was strong, and for a long time she accepted that word as a compliment, without realizing it had slowly become a prison. Strength had become her persona, the face she wore so consistently that even she had begun to forget there was a tired woman underneath it. On a Thursday evening in late October, after a long day at the clinic headquarters, she drove home through a slow rain that blurred the red lights ahead of her into glowing circles. Her phone sat in the cup holder, silent for most of the drive. She had been waiting for a message all afternoon, telling herself she was not waiting, telling herself she was focused, telling herself she was too mature to need clarity from someone who kept giving her confusion. Then, a few blocks from home, the screen lit up. The message was short. I do not know what I want right now. Nothing dramatic. Nothing openly cruel. Just a sentence vague enough to keep her hoping and cold enough to make her feel alone. She pulled into the parking lot outside her apartment building and sat there with both hands resting on the steering wheel. The rain tapped softly against the windshield. Across the street, a porch light flickered on. For several minutes, she did not move. She had answered messages like that before with patience, understanding, careful warmth, and quiet self-abandonment disguised as grace. She knew exactly how to respond in a way that would not pressure him, would not scare him away, would not make her appear needy, would not risk losing the fragile thread she had been holding for months. But that night, something in her could not reach for the old script. The words were there, but her soul would not enter them. And then the question came, not as a loud revelation, but as a quiet sentence rising from some deeper room within her. Am I holding this because it is still alive, or because I am afraid that letting go would mean I failed? That question did not accuse her. It revealed her. For the first time, Rebecca saw that she had not only been trying to preserve a relationship, she had been trying to preserve the image of herself as the woman who could love wisely enough, wait patiently enough, and manage uncertainty gracefully enough to make someone choose her clearly. Her ego wanted to reply, to repair, to keep the door slightly open. But the self, that deeper organizing center Jung described, was asking for something more honest than another polished response. It was asking her to stop confusing anxiety with devotion. In the language of faith, this was the moment God did not remove the pain, but interrupted the pattern. Rebecca did not make a dramatic decision that night. She did not rewrite her entire life. She simply placed the phone face down on the passenger seat, leaned back, and let the silence stay. And in that silence, she did something she had not done in years. She stopped trying to hold the whole world together for one evening, and allowed God to hold what her fear could not fix. The next morning, Rebecca woke before her alarm, not because she felt peaceful, but because the old anxiety returned like a familiar hand on her shoulder. The phone was on the nightstand, face down, exactly where she had placed it after walking in from the rain. For a moment, the room was gray and quiet, with the faint sound of traffic moving along the wet street outside her apartment. Her first impulse was to check whether another message had come. Her second impulse was to write something gentle, something wise, something that would make the uncertainty feel less sharp. But beneath those impulses, something else was becoming visible. She was not only wanting connection. She was wanting relief from the discomfort of not being chosen clearly. And this is where the deeper work often begins, Because what you cannot see is not always something being built in the direction you expected. Sometimes what God is arranging first is a dismantling, not a destruction of your future, but a removal of the hidden attachments that would make you unable to receive that future freely. The ego usually imagines divine arrangement as an immediate gift, a return call, a new opportunity, a sudden answer, a door opening with warm light pouring through it. But God may begin in a quieter way. He may begin by loosening the need to be approved by someone uncertain. He may begin by exposing the fear beneath your patience. He may begin by showing you that what you called loyalty was sometimes self-abandonment wearing softer clothes. In Jungian language, this is the moment the persona starts to crack. Rebecca had lived for years inside the image of the understanding woman, the composed woman, the woman who could hold ambiguity without asking for too much. That image had helped her move through the world, but it had also trained her to silence her deeper needs before anyone else had to honor them. The shadow, the part of her she had pushed away, was not something ugly. It was her honest anger, her need for clarity, her grief, her desire to stop auditioning for a place in someone else's life. And when the shadow begins to rise, the ego often feels ashamed. It says, do not feel that. Be patient. Be kind. Be above this. But the self does not ask you to be above your truth. The self asks you to become whole enough to stop betraying it. That morning, Rebecca did not have a grand revelation. She made coffee, stood barefoot in the kitchen, and watched steam rise from the mug like a small white cloud. She realized that for months she had been asking God to fix the situation, but perhaps God was first revealing the structure inside her that had made the situation so difficult to release. She had prayed for clarity, and clarity was arriving, not as a comforting answer, but as an honest mirror. The relationship was not the only thing being examined. Her pattern was being examined. Her need to manage another person's uncertainty was being examined. Her fear that walking away from confusion meant losing love was being examined. This is why surrender can feel painful before it feels peaceful. Something is being taken apart, and the ego mistakes that as loss. But sometimes what is falling away is not the promise. It is the false version of you that believed the promise could only come through control, waiting, and quiet self-erasure. God may be arranging what you cannot see by first removing what you were never meant to carry into the next chapter. The first days after Rebecca stopped responding from fear did not feel like freedom. They felt like a quiet room after everyone had left, and the silence seemed almost too large for her body to hold. She had imagined that surrender would bring immediate peace, as if one honest decision would cause her nervous system to soften and her heart to rest. But what happened instead was more unsettling. The space she used to fill with checking, explaining, waiting, and rehearsing possible conversations was suddenly empty, and in that emptiness, the old ache became louder. This is the part many people are not prepared for. When you stop forcing, you do not only lose the behavior. You meet the anxiety that the behavior was protecting you from. You discover how often you reach for your phone not because there was anything new to see, but because the act of reaching gave your fear something to do. You discover how often you replayed conversations not because they contained an answer, but because analysis felt safer than trust. You discover how often you called your control love, your overthinking wisdom, and your constant availability patience. In Jungian language, this is the withdrawal of psychic energy from an old pattern, and at first it can feel like being deprived of something essential. The ego panics because it has mistaken the pattern for safety. It says, send the message. Check again. Explain yourself one more time. Keep the connection warm. Do not let the silence become permanent. But the deeper self knows that a silence you cannot survive without controlling was never true peace. It was dependency wearing the appearance of devotion. For Rebecca, the test came on a Saturday afternoon. She had gone grocery shopping at a small market not far from her apartment, and while standing in the produce aisle, she felt the familiar impulse rise. Maybe she should send something simple. Maybe just a kind sentence. Maybe just enough to remind him she was still there. The thought seemed harmless, even mature. But underneath it was the same. Old fear. The fear that if she did not keep herself visible, she would be forgotten. She placed a bag of apples into her cart and stood still for a moment, surrounded by ordinary sounds. A cart wheel squeaking, someone laughing near the bakery, rain tapping softly against the front windows. Nothing spiritual appeared on the outside. No dramatic sign interrupted the moment. Yet inside, a clear question came forward. Am I about to act from peace, or am I about to obey panic? That question became a doorway. Not a large one, not a bright one, but real enough to step through. She did not send the message. She finished shopping, drove home, made soup, and let the evening be uncomfortable without trying to fix it. And that was the beginning of a different strength. Not the strength of holding everything together, but the strength of not returning to what had been keeping her divided. In the language of faith, this is often where God does some of the most hidden work. Not in the moment when you receive what you wanted, but in the moment when you stop using fear to chase it. The empty space after surrender is not a punishment. It is a cleansing. It is the inner wilderness where old attachments lose their power because you refuse to feed them with another act of self-betrayal. And if you can remain there without rushing back to the familiar, something quiet begins to grow. The self becomes easier to hear. The body begins to trust that it will not collapse without control. The soul begins to remember that peace is not the reward for getting an answer. Peace is what returns when you stop abandoning yourself in order to force one. In the weeks that followed, Rebecca did not receive a dramatic answer, and that was important. No sudden message arrived to explain everything. No perfect opportunity appeared at her door with a clear label on it. No voice from heaven told her exactly where to go next. Instead, the first signs were almost too small for the old version of her to respect. One morning, she woke and noticed that she did not reach for her phone immediately. The urge was still there, but it no longer ruled the first 30 seconds of her day. Another afternoon, during a meeting at work, a senior director mentioned a project management certification program the company might support, and something in Rebecca became quietly alert, as if a forgotten room inside her had opened a window. A few days later, while walking near Mount Tabor after work, she passed a woman sitting on a bench reading a book about transitions in midlife, and for reasons she could not fully explain, the title stayed with her all evening. None of these moments looked impressive from the outside. They were not the kind of signs that could prove anything to another person. But Jung understood that the psyche does not always speak through loud events. Sometimes it speaks through meaningful coincidence, through resonance, through an outer detail that touches an inner question at exactly the right moment. Synchronicity is not about becoming superstitious or trying to turn every passing detail into a command. It is about becoming awake enough to notice when life outside you and life inside you begin to answer one another in a language deeper than logic. For so long, Rebecca had demanded one large sign because her ego wanted certainty. But now that the panic had softened, she began to perceive smaller forms of guidance. A conversation that would have once sounded ordinary now felt like an invitation. A quiet morning without urgency felt like healing. A delayed response from someone else no longer felt like the center of her life. It became information, not identity. This is what happens when control loosens. Perception returns. The soul, no longer crowded by fear, starts to recognize the little lights along the path. In the language of faith, God often arranges gently before he arranges visibly. He may first return your attention to yourself. He may send one sentence through an unexpected person. He may place an old dream back in your hands, not as pressure, but as remembrance. He may allow a false attachment to grow quieter so that a true calling can finally be heard. Rebecca began keeping a small notebook in her kitchen drawer. Each night, before bed, she wrote down one thing she noticed without forcing an interpretation. A calm moment during her commute. A new idea at work. A boundary she kept without explaining herself. A prayer that was less about getting her way and more about being guided by truth. At first, the list looked ordinary. But after several weeks, she saw a pattern. Life was not shouting. It was arranging. The path was not appearing all at once. It was arriving like dawn, one thin line of light at a time. And perhaps this is why many people miss what is being prepared for them. They are waiting for a door to burst open, while God is first teaching their eyes to adjust to the light. Surrender did not make Rebecca passive. That was the quiet correction she had to learn, because for many years she had believed there were only two choices: either control everything or collapse into doing nothing. But the soul matures when it discovers a third way, a way that is neither panic nor resignation. It is the way of doing your part with honesty while releasing the part that was never yours to carry. Rebecca began to see this in ordinary moments. She could not make another person become clear, but she could become clear about what kind of uncertainty she would no longer organize her life around. She could not force a new career path to appear overnight, but she could update her resume, speak with human resources about the certification program, and spend 30 minutes each evening studying instead of scrolling through old messages. She could not arrange every future meeting, every opportunity, every answer, or every open door, but she could prepare the inner and outer life that would be ready when the right door appeared. This is where the difference becomes sacred. Your part is preparation. God's part is timing. Your part is truthfulness. God's part is orchestration. Your part is obedience to what you already know in your spirit. God's part is connecting what your eyes cannot yet trace. The ego suffers because it wants to cross into God's territory. It wants to manage outcomes, soften other people's confusion, predict every delay, and force life to prove that nothing has been wasted. But when the ego tries to do God's work, the body becomes exhausted, the mind becomes noisy, and the soul begins to feel as if it is living under a ceiling too low for its real breath. Jung might say that this is what happens when consciousness becomes too identified with control. The ego forgets that it is not the whole personality. It forgets the deeper center, the self, which does not need to dominate life in order to participate in it faithfully. In Rebecca's life, this realization became practical. She stopped writing messages that were only disguised attempts to receive reassurance. She stopped explaining her needs to someone who had already understood enough to respond differently if he wanted to. She began walking 2 miles in the morning before work, not to become a different person, but to return to the one who had been buried under years of tension. She called her younger sister on Sunday evenings and told the truth without making herself sound more composed than she felt. She prayed differently too. Not, God, make this happen the way I want, but, God, make me honest enough to recognize what is from you, and strong enough to release what only looks like love because it is familiar. That prayer changed the atmosphere of her waiting. It did not remove all uncertainty, but it removed the illusion that uncertainty had to be managed by fear. In the weeks that followed, Rebecca still had difficult days. Sometimes she missed the old attachment with surprising intensity. Sometimes she wanted quick proof that she had chosen correctly. But now she understood that peace was not built by forcing the future to answer on demand. Peace was built by doing the next right thing without reaching for the steering wheel that belonged in God's hands. And this is the hidden discipline of surrender. You still show up. You still prepare. You still tell the truth. You still build capacity. You still keep your heart clean. But you stop trying to manipulate the invisible. You stop planting a seed in the morning and digging it up by nightfall to see whether God has kept his promise. You let roots do their work in the dark. You let timing become holy again. You let your life become spacious enough for what is real to find you without being chased. 3 months later, Rebecca Miller was not living inside a perfect ending, and that mattered, because real transformation rarely arrives like a movie scene where every loose thread is tied at once. Her apartment in Southeast Portland still looked mostly the same. The same narrow kitchen, the same rain-softened windows, the same small table where she drank coffee before work, the same city waking beyond the glass in shades of gray and gold. The clinic headquarters still had its long meetings, shifting deadlines, and tired people needing calm direction. There were still mornings when uncertainty came close enough for her to feel it in her chest. But something essential had changed. Rebecca was no longer treating uncertainty as a command to abandon herself. She had completed the first module of the certification program her company agreed to support. She had started blocking out 2 evenings a week for study, not as a desperate attempt to escape her life, but as a quiet act of faith that her life could still widen. She no longer left her phone beside her plate during dinner. She no longer paused in the middle of ordinary tasks to wonder whether someone else's silence had decided her worth. And when the man from that old attachment finally reached out again with another unclear message, gentle in tone but still avoiding truth, Rebecca did not feel the same inward collapse. She read it once, placed the phone on the table, and listened to the stillness inside her. There was sadness, yes. There was tenderness. There was even a small ache for the version of herself who would have answered immediately, trying to prove she was patient, safe, understanding, and easy to keep halfway. But beneath all of that, there was a new center. She did not need to punish him. She did not need to persuade him. She did not need to turn confusion into a spiritual assignment. She wrote one honest sentence. Not from anger and not from fear. I care about you, but I cannot keep organizing my heart around uncertainty. After she sent it, the room did not fill with instant relief. There was no dramatic sign, no sudden assurance that she had chosen the perfect path. But there was something quieter and more durable. Her body did not feel split. Her mouth had finally said what her soul had known. Jung might have called this a movement toward wholeness, the moment when the ego stops performing a familiar role and begins to serve the deeper self. The persona of the endlessly composed woman had loosened. The shadow that once carried her honest grief, anger, and longing was no longer locked away in the basement of the psyche. It had been brought into the light, not to take over her life, but to give her back the parts of herself she had abandoned in order to be chosen. In the language of faith, this was not merely Rebecca setting a boundary. It was God restoring order inside a woman who had spent years confusing love with self-erasure. A few weeks after that message, something unexpected happened at work. The senior director asked Rebecca to help coordinate a regional systems project across 3 clinics in Oregon and Washington. It was not the final answer to everything. It was not a grand destiny wrapped in shining paper. But it was a door, and unlike the doors she used to force, this one opened without her breaking herself against it. She felt nervous, but the nervousness was clean. It did not feel like panic. It felt like life stretching her capacity. On the morning she accepted, she walked her usual 2 miles before work. The air was cold enough to make her breath visible. The trees along the sidewalk were bare, but the eastern sky had begun to brighten behind them, a thin line of light gathering patiently at the edge of the day. She thought about how much of her life had been spent trying to drag the future into view before it was ready. She thought about all the energy she had poured into reading signs from people who would not speak clearly, forcing doors that only made her smaller, and praying for outcomes without asking whether she was becoming whole enough to receive them. And for the first time in a long time, she understood that peace had not come because every question had been answered. Peace had come because she was no longer negotiating with fear for permission to live truthfully. This is the mystery many people only understand after they have stopped forcing. What is meant for you does not require you to disappear from yourself in order to receive it. What is from God may challenge you, stretch you, humble you, and ask you to grow, but it will not demand that you keep betraying the quiet truth He has already placed inside your soul. And what is not meant for you may still carry affection, memory, and meaning, but meaning is not the same as assignment. Some things enter your life to reveal your pattern, not to become your future. Some delays are not empty roads. They are hidden classrooms. Some closed doors are not insults. They are mercy shaped like redirection. Some silences are not abandonment. They are the space where the old self finally stops performing and the real self begins to breathe. Rebecca still prayed, but her prayers had changed. She no longer prayed like someone trying to convince heaven to hurry. She prayed like someone learning to trust that heaven could see around corners she could not see. God, make me ready for what is real. God, remove what only looks like love because it is familiar. God, teach me to do my part without trying to steal yours. And perhaps that is where surrender becomes mature. It is not the end of effort. It is the end of fear pretending to be effort. It is not the refusal to care. It is the refusal to control what can only be received in truth. It is not losing your life. It is finally allowing your life to be arranged by a wisdom deeper than the ego's panic. So if you are standing in your own hallway, waiting for something you cannot yet see, do not assume nothing is happening. Roots grow in darkness. Dawn begins below the horizon. The ocean changes direction long before the shore notices. And sometimes, the first miracle is not that the door opens. The first miracle is that you become whole enough to stop forcing the wrong one.